Good morning and namaste to everyone. So I'm very happy that Neelima and Lakshay and the whole team, you thought of this particular topic and this series of essays by Sri Aurobindo, A Rationalistic Critic on Indian Culture. Because, as Lakshay, you were reading Sri Aurobindo's first dream, and you pointed out the exact phrase that ran through my mind also, this this exploration of Sri Aurobindo's essays, titled A Rationalistic Critic on Indian Culture, is our way to engage in that common action. So while we are working for or aspiring towards the unity that still has to come about, because Sri Aurobindo said that in 1947, but that's still true. There is still a lot of work that has to go to that unity. The first dream, the unity of India as a nation. So in that sense, it becomes very important to understand and identify and pinpoint those key or central aspects of our culture that have that give us the possibility of coming together, regardless of the outer diversity, of the outer differences, which actually would make the unity richer. So whether it's the difference in our identities, our regional, cultural, ethnic, religious identities, but as long as there is something inner that can bring us together. So with that aspiration, I have taken a closer look at these essays that Sri Aurobindo wrote and identified few themes. But at the same time, I also want to give, and for my own, it's like every time you dig into Sri Aurobindo's work, you find something new. It's like an ocean, you keep finding new gems again and again. So for that delight also, and as for sharing, I've identified some key points from these essays. So I'll run through some of those and then we'll see how it goes. So let's just move right along, just to give a quick background as to when these essays were written or first published. They were first published in the journal Arya that Sri Aurobindo was working or writing for in between February and July 1919. And it's a series of 6 essays. So the rationalistic critic that Sri Aurobindo is responding to is a gentleman named William Archer, who was a journalist and who also talked or spoke of himself as a literary and dramatic critic, though Sri Aurobindo brings up questions as to how qualified he was as a literary critic as well. But anyway, at one point, Sri Aurobindo later on said that he would have liked to revise some of these essays and take out the references that were specifically about William Archer's comments, to which he was replying in these essays. But he never got the time to do that. But I think as lovers of Sri Aurobindo and as people who delight in his writings, there is a special joy that you get in reading through these essays, because there is a lot of interesting use of satire, humor, and polemic that Sri Aurobindo is using. So as a work of literature, these are marvelous essays, how he's replying to some of the comments by this William Archer. So from each of these 6 essays, what I have done is I've taken out one point each, which Sri Aurobindo expands on. And the first 2 essays are very interesting because before he goes into describing some of the essential aspects of Indian culture, he also gives us a wonderful theory of cultural criticism itself. So that itself can be a very important field of scholarly study for cultural criticism. How to look across cultures, how to study cultures that are different from your own, the one that you were born in. So he gives us a whole theory on that. In the second essay, I'm just going to give a quick run through here. We find what is very important is what we find is a wonderful definition of culture itself. Nowhere else you would find this way of defining or understanding what is culture itself. In the third one, he focuses more on the life-affirming aspect of Indian spirituality and how that has not been understood or even, given a good weightage, not just by the rationalistic critic. See, this rationalistic critic does not have to be a Western, somebody in the Western body. One of the reasons why these essays are important is because there are a lot of rationalistic critics within India itself. So I guess the dialogue is between two ways of looking at existence, life, and Indian culture. So the one for whom there is nothing beyond rationality and reason, and for the other mindset or the other mentality which begins with spirit as the essential first truth, and everything else as an expression of the spirit. So in that third essay, he speaks about this major misconception that is out there about Indian spirituality being an inward turning, navel gazing, extremely wee metaphysical kind of thing. So he will talk about the life affirming nature of Indian spirituality. In the fourth and the fifth, he speaks on specific aspects on what's the difference between an Indian and a more rational / Western materialistic outlook on religion, and Indian versus rationalistic view on life, outlook on life, and the goals, the aims that one should have in life. And finally, in the sixth one, there is quite a bit of discussion on, again, something that's very important in a culture, how individual connects with the societal frame. What's the connection between individual and society, and how together they are moving toward some sort of a goal for higher perfection. So moving right along with the first one about the theory of cultural criticism. And Sri Aurobindo speaks of three ways of seeing a culture that is different from one's own. One is where we identify with the spirit of the culture. And we have totally understood the spirit, the essence of what this other culture is about. That is what he speaks of, the eye of sympathy and intuition. So he gives an example of Sister Nivedita's work on Indian culture. He also gives an example of John Woodruff's work on Tantra, on Shakti. And in fact, in the same volume in which you will find these essays, Complete Works of Sri Aurobindo, Volume 20, there is another series of essays called Is India Civilized? And Sri Aurobindo took this title. And so, Is India Civilized with a question mark? It is his ode to John Woodruff's book by the same title, which again was a response to another rationalistic critic. So John Woodruff's work, Sri Aurobindo held in high esteem. Later on, he also gives example of Ananda Kumar Swami's insights into Indian art in particular. So how some of these critics were able to empathize and get into the spirit of Indian culture. That is one approach to study a culture other than one's own. The second is the eye of discerning and dispassionate critic. He is one or she is one who would be able to, in a very objective way, identify that these are the facts of this culture and these are some add-ons that have accumulated over the course of time. So this works, this does not work. So very objective look, very dispassionate look. Sri Aurobindo says we can learn certainly from both of these approaches. And then is the third one, the hostile critic, which is where he puts this gentleman, William Archer, to whose essays he was responding. And he builds a beautiful case. You have to read it to really feel the joy in it, how even the eye of the hostile critic gives us so much to learn from. He says it not only helps us become more objective about our culture, but it helps us see what is the one thing that, or the essential parts of our culture that feels so disgusting to someone like this hostile critic. So in that also, Sri Aurobindo being Sri Aurobindo, he'll find something to bring out, the good to be brought out even from essays like this gentleman's William Archer. So, but there again, he kind of just little bit, he warns us, cautions us a little bit. But for us to be able to find any value in this hostile critic's work, it has to have there has to be some value in the work. It cannot be simply slander or vitriol, poison that he's just pouring out there, which he again says in beautiful way why William Archer was not qualified to speak about things that he tried to speak about. So he says, first of all, very clearly says, this whole work, William Archer's work, has a political agenda. So which was that, to show that Indian culture is so inferior and Indians will not be able to, they're not qualified to be independent, to be free. So he speaks very clearly about that it's, to damage, that India must be proved barbarous in order to destroy or damage her case for self-government. So he said this political agenda, we have to first leave it aside. That itself makes his work not worthy. Second, there is an ill-informed misrepresentation of facts because this fellow, the rationalistic critic, William Archer, did not have the right qualifications to even do literary criticism, even though he had a background in that, because he was, again, not able to understand the essence which has been poured into the entire body of ancient and medieval Indian literature. But he said, okay, we can leave that aside. And yet, Sri Aurobindo says we have to look at his work. So these two first reasons could have been easily, he said, I don't need to reply. But yet, he takes the trouble to write 100-page worth of essays to reply to the criticism because of this last point, he says, because there is much in Archer's writing that even though he says it expresses crudely, but still with sufficient accuracy, the feeling of recoil of the average Occidental mind, average Western mind, at its first view of all that is unique and different in Indian culture. And then later on, he speaks about why this average understanding is important. So he says, see, again, Sri Aurobindo, as Lakshay, you also read out, he's always thinking about future. Past is only a springboard to get into future. Sri Aurobindo's concern is very much about how to bring East and West together, which is why he's doing all this work. So he says, because if the future has to bring India and the West together, we have to understand why there is such a gross misrepresentation or gross misunderstanding. And for that, he says, you cannot look at the cultured mind of the West who has somehow understood the intricacies of what is beautiful about Indian culture or the spiritual foundation of Indian culture. So he says this beautifully, the cultured mind, these are exact his words, tends to diminish the force of these prejudices, or at least even in difference and opposition, to develop points of similarity. So again, we have to look at what does Sri Aurobindo mean by cultured mind. Cultured mind is not someone who has read a lot or went through a lot of art exhibitions or has learned music and appreciation of art and things like that. That's where I think, that's why Sri Aurobindo was so, I should say, perceptive of giving in the very second essay the definition of culture. Because once we know that, we'll have a better understanding of what is a cultured mind. Elsewhere in his other writings, he speaks of that also. But the mind that has been, see, in India, the word that comes closest to culture is Samskriti, right? Samskriti means one that has been created to perfection. That's Sanskrit, Samskriti. Kriti is created, some meaning whole, all, total, complete. One that has been created to perfection. It's that cultured mind which has perfected itself. And we all know how Sri Aurobindo in his writings on yoga speaks about what mental perfection means. So the cultured mind is not going to be so much bothered by the differences. It will also go in for, always go in for similarities, how to bring things together, to create a sense of harmony. But it's the average mind, Sri Aurobindo says, who's always, from there we get the bedrock of the psychological differences which divide from each other these two great blocks of our common humanity, the Eastern and the Western way of looking at life, or rather the Indian and the Western. When I say Western, I'm not speaking about geography, more like a Western / rationalistic, materialistic approach or view of existence and life. So why these two are divided? To understand that, we have to look at what an average rationalistic mind speaks like. That's why he said that's where we get the essence of the difference. And that is where the solution to the future unity will come about. So that's why he's so clear about, to understand the difference. And then again, as I said, as a theorist of cultural critic, looking even at the work of somebody like William Archer or another work that later came about, Catherine Mayo's Mother India, which Gandhiji had spoken of as a gutter inspector's report, something like that. It was always looking at all that was, really, the downside of the culture. But Sri Aurobindo would say, those works sometimes help us understand that psychological difference, and we have to put aside all our personal feeling and personal recoil. You can't talk about my Indian culture this way. We have to let go of that feeling and try to objectively see, is there anything worth responding to? And this is very important, again, when we bring in Sri Aurobindo's third dream also, world unity. So, it's very applicable for that aspect as well. So, another important point Sri Aurobindo speaks of is why so much misunderstanding from the Western rationalistic point of view towards Indian culture. This is a phenomenon more of the modern scientific rationalistic age. He said the ancient Western Occidental mind, the ancient Greek mind, would have much less difficulty getting into the spirit of Indian culture because the pursuit of perfection was there inherent in that culture also, even though their approach to it was very different. So the pursuit of aesthetic perfection, the pursuit of even intellectual perfection was there in the ancient Greek. Except what has happened in the modern scientific rational Western culture is there is a lot of utilitarianism and elevating of the reason, practical reason as a godhead that has happened, which was not necessarily the case in the ancient Occidental culture. So this is so far about the first essay. As I said, the key thing that we can derive from the second essay is this very definition of culture. And again, if we spend some time reflecting on this, we understand how Sri Aurobindo is defining culture in a uniquely Indian way, which starts from inside out. Let's understand what is the essence of a culture, or what is the soul of a culture, he says. So he defines culture as expression of consciousness of people, or consciousness of life that reflects itself or that manifests itself in three ways. None of these ways are, he says, direct expression of the spirit, which is still behind, yet they try to express it to whatever extent possible. And what are these three expressions? The soul, mind, body. So what is the soul of a culture? Soul of a culture is that which the collective consciousness of people come up with as their highest aspiration, their highest thought, which is the highest philosophy, the highest spiritual way of looking at religion itself. This is what would be the soul of culture. To understand a culture, he would say, first try to grasp what is the soul of culture. Then comes the mind of a culture, which is where everything that mind, the higher, from the practical reason to the higher ranges of mind, creates. So all art, poetry, literature, scientific advancements, technological advancements that a collective produces is the mind of a culture. And finally, the outer life, the practical, sociological, social, economic, political setups that a people come up with is the body of a culture. Generally, what happens is how a rationalistic critic would look at it, because for him or her, the highest is the rationality. The highest is the practical reason. He or she will start looking at from the body. Oh, India is just caste-ridden society. Nothing good can come out of it. Leave it there. There's no need to move beyond. Sri Aurobindo, the cultural critic, would tell us first grasp the soul of a culture, then try to understand to what extent the culture was able to express the soul through its various mental, intellectual creations, scientific, aesthetic creations, then try to get a sense of to what extent it was able to express the truth of its soul and mind through its bodily creations, the social setup, whether it is the something called Chaturvarna, the outer, fourfold order Indian culture created, or whether it is, monarchy versus democracy as a political setup or economic setup, whether it is Chanakya's or Shukraniti or, all those kinds of things. So look at all that to understand a culture. In the same essay, he speaks of several key characteristics of Indian culture. I'm just pointing out one or two because everything else gets sort of reflected through these. The first one is what is unique about Indian culture is that it is the soul that has led the advance of the culture. So it is the highest philosophy, the highest spiritual thought that forms Indian religion. So when Sri Aurobindo uses this word Indian religion, as I understand it, he's referring to all those religion, because see, in India we don't have the word religion, we had the word dharma, which is nowhere close to religion. And yet, if we are living in 21st century, we are using these words to identify different faith systems. By Indian religion, he refers to all those faith systems that have their origin in what we in India call as Sanatan Dharma. So whether it is Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikh, Panth, and within there are several sects within Hinduism, Buddhism itself, even Jainism, there are several subsects. So all those that find their origin in Sanatan Dharma. What's the highest spiritual thought behind that? It's that which has led the advance of Indian culture and civilization, and mind and body have tried to follow it to whatever extent possible. This is one very important and very unique thing about Indian culture and civilization, which often the rationalistic mind will miss. And the second thing is that Indian culture has always been a more spiritual, inward turning culture. Even when it emphasizes all outer life, it would never allow us to forget that there is a spirit behind, that all this Leela that we are part of, there is a deeper truth behind it. Enjoy the Leela as much as you want, but always remember the truth is behind all this. So that's one very important. And this is where Sri Aurobindo gives us two very important terms: rationalistic modernism and spiritual modernism. India is not 5th century or 18th century or 19th century. India today is 21st century and 22nd, 23rd, and yet we have to bring all that with us. So Sri Aurobindo says in a beautiful passage that one of the things India should be telling, or an Indian mind should tell the rationalistic critic, is first come up to my level of spirituality, and then I will show you what spiritual modernism could be like. But we haven't understood that. That is why we see our own inner conflicts. It's not just the conflict between Hindus and Muslims and Christians and this and that, or languages, or north, south, east, west. But it's this conflict also. We have to be modern, but we don't have to be modern in the rationalistic modern sense. We have to be modern in the spiritual modernistic sense. What the spiritual modernity of India will be for present and for future, that is for all of us to work through, to aspire. So this is why I think even though these essays were written in 1919, they still carry those seeds of truth that are so relevant for us today. Last week I was in Kolkata and I was talking to somebody, and we were looking at, we were just talking about the house in which Gandhi was born in Porbandar, and a few years ago I had visited that, and this was in Sri Aurobindo Bhavan, Kolkata. So the house, there is some controversy or something not clear exactly about whether Sri Aurobindo was born in that house because of some historical records, and yet that is considered at his birth, as it has been agreed that this is his birthplace. So we were talking about how Porbandar's house, where Gandhi was born, and how ill-maintained it was, and there was some sort of you're still living in old times, and modernity hasn't touched that building. And yet in Sri Aurobindo Bhavan, even though it can still use a lot of maintenance, yet modernity was part of the very outer construction of that building itself. And we were talking about how in certain parts of India there was much resistance towards modernity. This is during the British time. And certain parts of India, especially Bengal, where modernity had come in. But yet there is this interesting issue to explore, whether this modernity that India needs to have has to be only a copy of the rationalistic West, or it can be something like the spiritual modernism that Sri Aurobindo speaks about. So that's that. And then Sri Aurobindo takes us to two key questions. Sorry, I should go back. Oh, what are these two key questions? So ultimately he tells through all his analysis that there are two things to look at: whether the spiritual or the religio-philosophical view of life that Indian culture emphasizes, whether that has the right answer to man's constant quest for a perfection, or whether the rational, utilitarian, materialistic approach to life and existence can give us the right approach to work towards this constant aspiration for a higher perfection, or the best lead to the mankind. So whether it is only the practical reason of the rationalistic mind that will take us to the next level of humankind's march, or whether it is the spiritual or the religio-philosophic view that Indian culture emphasizes. And he says, if it is the first one, if it is the Indian spiritual, if it's the spiritual religio-philosophic view, then we have to ask that the expression that India gave to that view, it's not a conflict between India and West, essentially. It's a conflict between two ways of looking at life, two approaches to look at life and existence and meaning of life and aim of human life. If it is the spiritual that will take us to the next level of evolution, then has India and the expression that India has given to that view of life, does it have something to teach us? So these are the two questions he poses. This is the universal mind. This is not a parochial, chauvinistic look at all that is good at India. He's always thinking about the universal, the human experience. So then again, he gives very interestingly, I don't know, people think Sri Aurobindo is difficult to read, but I find him so systematic. If you he'll give you 1, 2, 3. You can just highlight things like that. So he's given more. I've just highlighted 3 things here following him. So in rationalistic and the external view of life, which is only starting from the body, there are three things that are highlights. One, it is dominated by the environmental necessity. What is needed right now to solve a problem and practical reason? This mind or this view of life accepts higher pursuits of the mind like philosophy, and yet thinks that this is not something to do with life. It's good to decorate, have good books of philosophy in your bookshelf and look cultured. So it will value philosophers, but it will say they cannot address the practical problems of life. And the third thing is, if they do have a religion, it's the religion of earth. Religion of, what's the problem in life that I have to solve, and can religion help us address that? So it's a religion of life, religion of earth. An ideal that it puts for us is ideal of intellectual growth, vital perfection, human vital efficiency, health, social, rational order, everything. On the other hand, the spiritual and religio-philosophical view of life will accept reason as important, and yet it will subordinate reason to something that is beyond reason. So it subordinates reason to a supra-rational aspect, supra-rational element, which is spirituality. And while it values life and action, it subordinate life and action also to some sort of a intangible feeling that there is something beyond all this, something beyond life and action. The second thing, in terms of philosophy, their philosophy is a pursuit apart from life. Here, philosophy is concerned with very practical problems of life, because for them, life begins with the truth of the spirit, for this particular view of life. So philosophy, the whole aim of Indian philosophy has been how to get this vidya, this knowledge of the spirit, which once attained, everything else can be known, everything else can be addressed. So it's very connected with life. It's not just a pursuit to do in leisurely pastime. It is very practical in that sense. And because philosophy is so connected with life, in India, even the word is darshan. It's not a speculation. It's seeing. You see the truth of life and spirit, and you work from there. So the highest aim of religion is also very connected with the highest aim of the Indian darshan, Indian philosophy. So all that is high in Sanatan Dharma comes from the highest philosophical, the highest darshan, the highest vision of our ancient rishis from Vedic Upanishadic times. So this is in summary of that. Another important thing that he speaks about when he's describing the difference between the two. So for the rationalistic mind or the rationalistic view of life, philosophers are good, valued, all important. But for the Indian mind, there is another figure called Rishi, which Sri Aurobindo, in another essay, which I think is compiled in volume 13, where he speaks about that typically we think of two kinds of people. One who are idealists, one who are executives. So those who try to execute the ideal in practical life. But Indian mind has come up with this other idea of Rishi, who is beyond, or who is rather an integration of both the idealist and the executive. Because he not only sees, Rishi is one who sees the truth, he also has the will to put it in action. Hence, all our Vedic rishis were not navel-gazing, brahmacharis. They were all married grahas, living with not only their families, but their students, their shishyas. So they were managing households, So they were managing practical problems. There were rishis who had mastered warfare, all kinds of weapons, invented weapons. So things like that. So Rishi, Sri Aurobindo says, this Indian mind puts Rishi much higher than all philosophers and thinkers. I think we should just read his own words. The Indian mind holds that the Rishi, the thinker, the seer of spiritual truth, is the best guide. The rishi is the natural director of society, which is why we had this parampara of Raj rishis in India. All kings used to have, a rishi to refer to whenever there was a conflict, whenever there was an issue that they needed. So in the Ramayana, Valmiki Ramayana comes when Dashrath wants his son Ram to become the next king, or to announce that he is the now, crown prince. He first invites Rishi Vashisht, who is the Raj Rishi, to ask whether that's the right thing to be done, and there is a whole conversation about that. And then the Raj Rishi suggests that let's call an assembly. How democratic. All the, fiduciaries should come, and the courtly people will come and then decide. And then the announcement is made that Ram is now the Yuvraj. So Rishi is the natural director of society for the Indian mind. To rishis, he attributes the ideals and guiding institutions of his civilization. So Sri Aurobindo has written a lot of passages in some of his writings in the same volume, Foundations of Indian Culture, and elsewhere, also as rishi as the maker of Indian civilization. So he says, and then even today the Indian mind is ready to give the title of rishi to anyone who can go beyond what is seen. So he says this particularly with reference to Bankim Chandra, where he says how he was channeling the rishihood when he came up with the slogan Vande Mataram. So things like that. Okay. So I don't know if it's visible, but just another beautiful sentence from the same essay where he describes the Indian believes why Indian mind would put rishi above all intellectual philosophers or all idealists even, because for the Indian mind, truths of the spirit are the ultimate truths. So he says the ultimate truths are truths of the spirit, and that truths of the spirit are the most fundamental and most effective truths of our existence. Powerfully creative of the inner, salutarily reformative of the outer life. So if we can grasp the truths of the spirit, we have the key to reform or beautify or harmonize the outer life as well, which is what the Indian mind believes, which is why rishi in the Indian outer societal framework was considered outside of the Chaturvarna. Rishi could have come from any background. Both our Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are the works of two rishis who were born in what today would be understood as depressed classes in Indian constitution, or in the scheduled castes, Valmiki and Vyas. They were both of very low parentage, and yet Indian mind gave them the status of rishi. That's the beauty, because truths of the spirit are to the Indian mind ultimate, and these people have they have perfected themselves, the rishis have perfected themselves to hear and see the truth, Satya Drishta and Satya Shrota. But to the European, again, it's not just about the body, the European body or the European geography, but to more of a rationalistic, materialistic view. Ultimate truths are often the truths of the highest intellect, the ideative, where the pure ideas come from. And yet, that's the philosophy, the highest philosophy would be. And yet he would say these truths are nothing to do with my outer practical life. And Sri Aurobindo used the word that they say these are tests of values. Will it help me have a better life? Will it help me get a better microwave? Things like that. Just simple things like, my husband often says, we have had so much advanced technology, and yet we haven't figured out, how the setting on your bread toaster, you can't figure it out how exact brown you want. So this is the imprecision, because we are just working through matter. So that's one of his complaints for the rationalistic critic. So the average, remember we are talking of the averaged positivist mind. So the averaged positivist mind, not the cultured mind. Again, the systematic writer Sri Aurobindo, he pulls out three things. For this kind of mind, what is the one problem that they have with Indian psychology? It's a jungle of self-hypnotic hallucinations. Look at he's a poet when writing prose. Indian religion, one problem with Indian religion, a rank growth of anti-rational superstitions. Everything comes. These are the criticism. And all that is wrong with Indian philosophy, it's a remote cloud land of unsubstantial speculation. You see, I'm so happy actually he didn't revise these essays, because he might have taken out these, wonderful expressions. So this is I can just stop here. We can have a discussion just about all this. But Sri Aurobindo continues. So he says, for example, what we think of spirituality is that this is something beyond the outer mental, vital nature, something supra-rational. But for the rationalist, he doesn't understand spirit in this sense, because for him or her, there is something called as God, but that God is what? Life, human will force, and reason. These are their Godheads, nothing beyond that. So, can there be anything beyond outer mental nature that we understand? For them, it doesn't exist. I'll go a little bit deeper into the criticism that the rationalistic mind has for Indian philosophy, and I'll skip the religion part. Maybe it will come later through the discussion also. But for the Indian philosophy, it turns away from life, nature, and the will of the human being to do something meaningful with his life or her life, because he's always looking at, what is Brahman? And, all that stuff. And Sri Aurobindo will, he gives examples actually to refute all these claims, but in the interest of time, I'm not going there, but I will encourage you all to really read those examples that he gives. The second criticism of Indian philosophy is that it preaches the unreality of the world. And it brings in all kinds of things like, karma, reincarnation, pessimism, asceticism, and that's why it has nothing to do with life. These are all ideas which the rationalistic mind will say are fatal to individuality. So while the rationalistic mind is so much about forming a personality, the Indian mind is about impersonality or transcending the personality. So that's why it's not connected with life, as per the rationalistic critic. It also emphasizes detachment from terrestrial interests. And Sri Aurobindo challenges that, how can it, preach detachment from terrestrial interest? Because most of the Indian literature, especially in Sanskrit, is about very practical aspects of life. And he gives particularly the example of Shukraniti. Shukra Rishi was the teacher of the Asuras in some of the Puranic stories. And he gave a theory of politics and economics, which again, very practical. So he just gives one example. We are a land of where all kinds of literature, from Kama Shastra to Arth Shastra to, warfare, everything is there. Hardly 15 to 20% of the entire body of Sanskrit literature today that we have has to do with philosophy actually. Most of it is very other aspects of life. So that's the example Sri Aurobindo gives. So right here he says, so the criticism is that Indian philosophy turns you away from study of nature as well as life. Study of nature, he says, it's a gross misrepresentation, and the only way we can accept it is if you ignore the entire history of Indian civilization. How the heck would we build these grand architectural marvels if we didn't know engineering, if we didn't know mathematics, if we didn't know geography, if that is what is understood by the study of nature? And then another important point Sri Aurobindo reminds us there is that we in India, especially in ancient and maybe up to a large extent in the medieval India, Indian mind was so keen on developing, systemizing knowledge. Hence, we even came up with a word called Shastra, which means a compendium of things, compendium of knowledge. So for each aspect of life, we had a Shastra, to the extent that we even had Shastra on wine making, horse breeding. So if we had all this, how could we be removed from study of nature? So that, he says, that itself is one proof on cultivation of scientific mind, scientific tendency. And then Sri Aurobindo builds a whole other case about how we were, so high up in mathematics, astronomy, trigonometry, the yagyashalas that were made with exact precision, exact geometrical precision. And there is a lot of research now for anybody who cares to look. And Sri Aurobindo says this, I'm not saying it. Anybody who wants to look through the historical documents, how India had attained so much in all outer life as well, in science and things like that. Surgery, of course, like we know, Ayurveda. The other criticism that Indian philosophy has nothing much to do with life, there Sri Aurobindo reminds us of the 4 Purusharthas. The very fact all of Indian life was organized around these aims of life, which the fourfold is the Kama, Artha, Dharma and Moksha. And some philosophers or some historians say that Moksha was added on a little later on, especially after the Buddhist advent. But earlier it was Kama, Artha and Dharma. Dharma has to be the basis, and on the basis of Dharma, pursuit of all kinds of sensual, physical satisfaction, aesthetic satisfaction, which is Kama, and pursuit of material well-being, which is Artha. So I always like to say, India was not invaded for its spiritual riches, India was invaded for its material riches. So we had to have that kind of material riches for all these invasions to happen. And as I said, the Indian literature itself is a proof that anybody who bothers to look at the body of Indian literature will find how closely connected with life it was. The Indian mind, in terms of organizing life and understanding the value of life and how life affirming it was, it recognized all human possibilities, even though it valued the spiritual aspiration as the highest. But it recognized that everybody has to walk in a certain gradual way. So the idea of graduality and gradual progress was very much understood by the Indian rishis. So they tried to come up with a system, a social organization, where people were divided into 4 broad classes. And when Sri Aurobindo describes this in the last essay in the series, he goes into greater detail about this Chatur Varna as to how these 4 classes are basically about the 4 key turnings of the soul towards 4 kinds of pursuits. So the Brahmin soul would be one that is more turned towards pursuit of knowledge, wisdom. The Kshatriya soul would be one that is more turned towards pursuit of power and courage. So on. The Vaishya would be more towards outer harmony and material well-being. That's the Vaishya. And the Shudra would be the outer perfection, the outer execution of details, in detail, and to offer service. So Sri Aurobindo has talked about that in great detail. But to all of these classes, people of all of these temperaments, the final ascent into Godhead was guaranteed. The whole education system was set up in a way where all these temperaments will be addressed. Proper ethical training will be given. So all of this was part of the body aspect of the culture, how the things were set up. Moving right along. As I said earlier, it's always given the highest value to that which rises beyond all the terrestrial, earthly occupation. I think I've already talked about that a little bit. So again, he summarizes this, that the difference, what we find between the typical Western or the rational or the typical Indian mentality is this, The West has acquired has acquired the religious mind. It's not possessed it by its own nature, whereas for the Indian, it's a very natural, organic way, because religious mind comes from its highest, what it values the highest, which is the spirit. So the India has constantly believed that there is a world, or rather worlds beyond the earthly world, the terrestrial world that we see it. So it's a very natural possession that there is something beyond. But for the Western mind, or for the rationalistic mind, there is nothing beyond what we see. So the phrase, what you see is what you get, exactly comes from that. First time I heard somebody even used an acronym, YZWIG. I said, what does that mean? What you see is what you get. That's just a very limited way of looking at life. Again, another reminder, Sri Aurobindo, in a very beautiful circular way, keeps on reminding various truths again and again, that at its highest, from the Vedic Upanishadic time, since then Indian spirituality has never been about a quiet monastic approach to spirit. It's been always very life-affirming. As I said, the rishis themselves were living a full household life. So it's been a high effort of the human spirit to rise beyond the life of desire and vital satisfaction and arrive at spiritual calm, greatness, strength, illumination. I think I've already covered this. This is where I think, Uma's, your question would come in. We'll take that up a little bit later. Indian religion is Indian spiritual philosophy put into action and experience. So that's where he says, just this one line from it, it's the philosophy put into practice. So another place, in another essay, Sri Aurobindo writes, it's the Indian religion is dynamic philosophy. It's dynamized by the philosophy, Indian philosophy is dynamized by religion, and Indian religion is philosophized by the highest spiritual thought. So the religion and philosophy are not two different things. And then he reminds us, the Sanatan Dharma, which goes by the name of Hinduism today, as one of the most tolerant and inclusive. It has taken in philosophical thought, understandings of life from all various traditions. And in fact, in the same series of essays, Sri Aurobindo makes a very important statement, which I think really need to be looked at in much greater detail, where he says it very clearly and categorically. This Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism would have taken in its fold even religions such as Islam and Christianity if they had tolerated the process of assimilation. It's a statement worth really deep reflection. So the tolerant, the assimilative nature of Sanatan Dharma, Sri Aurobindo spends time describing, and again he gives many examples of that. This is the criticism on the Indian religion part. So another criticism that the rationalistic critic has is that Indian religion is always thinking, or Indian philosophy is always talking about something unknowable. So Sri Aurobindo says, it admits that unknowable and unthinkable, anirvachaniye, about whom you cannot speak. And yet, its concern is about that which you can speak, which you can attain. That is where the religion comes in. So you cannot attain Brahman in one go, and yet you can become a beautiful soul that is completely devoted to one chosen form of divine, your Ishtadev, the one that your soul chooses. So it gives you a very practical way. For Meera, it was only Krishna. So when Meera writes there is a story, when Meera writes to Tulsidas that my in-laws' family is, doing all kinds of torture and I can't live. They don't see Krishna as the divine that he is. And, they don't want me to worship or pray or devote, stay as a devotee. Or for her, it was actually, she was the wife of Krishna, right? Or to be married to my Krishna. What should I do? Tulsidas writes in a beautiful chaupai, he says, I could not live where my Ram is not being accepted. For him, it is Ram, right? She writes about Krishna, he writes about Ram. Then Meera goes to Kashi, where Tulsidas ji is. Then Meera goes to see Kabir, for whom it is Ram throughout. Meera asks Kabir, you give me Ram Bhakti. I want to love Ram the way I love Krishna. And Kabir says, I am not the guru for you. You go to this person named Ravidas, who is a shoemaker. He works with leather. So she goes to Ravidas, a little outside of where Kabir was, a little farther away. And Ravidas comes from a very low caste, and he says, no, you're a princess. I cannot be your guru. And then she says, no, but Kabirji has sent me. Oh, Kabirji is like my older brother. So, yeah, you're my guru. And it's in Kashi. Mirabai writes that beautiful song, Payo ji maine Ram Ratan Dhan Payo. And throughout her life, she is a Krishna Bhakt, married to Krishna. For her, it's all Krishna. Mere to Girdhar Gopal. So, you cannot attain Brahman, but she merged into Krishna. Andal merged into Ranganatha, right? So through religion, through that kind of devotion, the practical thing. So Sri Aurobindo says Indian philosophy admits that there is something unknowable, and yet it is concerned with what is knowable and what is attainable. So that's where the dynamic aspect of spirituality comes in. And then Indian philosophy, also because it's not speculation, it says very boldly, you want to attain the level where I am at, follow the path. Path of karma, path of dhyana, path of bhakti. Follow the path, you will have the experience. It's a verifiable, it's as scientific as it can be, except that this is psychological subjective science. This is not a physical science. So that's something beautiful we find from Sri Aurobindo. I think I've already talked about these things. For the rationalistic mind, there are two cults, cult of life, cult of reason, which has given two godheads, industrialism, industrial rational progress, and physical science. And then Sri Aurobindo explains in a beautiful paragraph, which I think all our politicians should read, where why they talk about Indian unity. Often the unity is about whether India is a secular state or not, Hindus, Muslims. Sri Aurobindo speaks about how when a culture only looks at these two things, life and reason, the tendency to secularize everything is a natural consequence of that. And in the interest of time, I'm not going into detail of that, but he explains this beautifully. But a culture that begins with spirit as the fundamental truth, since spirit is not separate from life, the essential aspect of religion is also not cut off from life. So the whole debate about secularism can be resolved if we can have like a round table conference with all the politicians and policymakers and just have 2 days, just work on that one paragraph and come up with some policy guidelines from that. So that's a necessary consequence of the cult of life and reason, which is not the case with a culture like India. So naturally, when such a mind looks at all the chaos, so-called, seeming chaos of Hinduism or Indian spirituality in practice, it is a little bewildered, it is a little disgusted, even astonished, and Sri Aurobindo recognizes that how can, we have given up all these superstitions, you people are still following it, You go to places like Kashi, Haridwar, Rishikesh, these are places booming with practices that have been there since 5,000 years or more. So people are experiencing truth through these outer practices. So the Western temperament often gets, I think I'm just going to skip a little bit because these are things that I've already spoken of. The Western temperament always emphasizes the action. For the Indian mind, for the Indian spiritual view of life, action is important, but the highest is the sattvic poise, where action is done in the poise of that harmony, in the sattva. So I don't know if you can see this image of Krishna and Kali. There are stories about Radha, how there was how Radha used to go at the call of Krishna's flute every time. And one time at night, she heard the flute and she went, and all the gopis also went, and their husbands realized that something is wrong. Where have all our wives gone? So they followed her, and then Radha says, we have to do something. So Krishna turns into Kali. So he said, yeah, we are here, all the women are here for Kali worship. So no, nothing like that going on. But Sri Aurobindo actually, from a yogic point, he really takes this idea of Krishna and Kali. There was time he used to sign as Kali. So he speaks of his yoga, his integral yoga is bringing the two powers of Krishna and Kali together. So Krishna, the Anandamaya, and Kali, the force, the courage. As Sri Aurobindo says, love and courage are the only two virtues that will save the soul, even if everything is lost. So love is Krishna and courage is Kali. Sri Aurobindo gives a very interesting and long discussion on how, for the rationalistic critic, Indian philosophy and Indian religion do not talk about ethics. And there is one line of Sri Aurobindo says, if there is anything that Indian mind has been concerned about other than spirit, is dharma. But for the rationalistic mind to understand what is dharma, it's a long inner and outer study. So dharma goes beyond ethics. So he gives a very interesting analysis of that. And there's just one example I've pulled out from that, where he speaks of relative standards, which the typical rationalistic mind will not understand. If it's non-violence all the way. And Sri Aurobindo says, for a Kshatriya, non-violence does not make sense. Yes, ahimsa paramo dharma, and yet a warrior has to be trained in all kinds of violence. In Mother's Conversations, you find out long, very interesting discussion about teaching peace to children, or even, she says her own example, how she learned fencing, and how that learning martial arts, learning arts of warriors can be a very good physical discipline. So Sri Aurobindo speaks of the relative standards of Indian ethics. So again, he brings us to some questions. He is an academic throughout, so he'll ask us questions. Having said all this, having said that Indian culture values all these high things that are beyond terrestrial occupations, does it have some connection with the daily life, the outer life? And for that, so I'll just read what he said. Apart from its transcendental aims, has it any pragmatic, non-ascetic, dynamic value? If so, then only it is worth preserving. He'd say it very clearly, very categorically. And then he tells us how to judge that. There are three powers that we can have to judge the life value of a culture. What was its original conception of life? For India, it was spirit as the ultimate truth, everything else as an expression of that. The power of forms, rhythms that it created to express that original conception of life, and the inspiration, the vigor with which it executed those forms. And if we have the same vigor and the same power today to execute those truths, because that's where the Renaissance in India will come about. The new birth will come about. So there I've just summarized what is the life value of Indian culture, and I think I already referred to it in a little bit, where he says that the Indian mind show a great spiritual tact. That's the word he uses. He says, yes, everybody has to become God. India recognizes that. But you're not going to become God just like that. You have to go through a proper gradual progress. So that approach to the spirit does not and cannot be sudden and simple. It has to be a gradual culture, gradual training. That's where the whole, how we had this organization of life in 4 stages: Brahmacharya, Grahasth, Vanprasth, Sannyas, the 4 stages of life. So grahast, the stage of a householder, Mahabharata says very clearly it's the most important stage in one's life to grow inwardly and outwardly. But at every moment, while going through all these stages, at every moment, the culture insisted of something beyond. That's why we had, a grahast had to do so many yagnas, had to do so much dana, had to constantly invoke divine at the start of every ritual, every work. A child is born or a woman is pregnant, invoke the divine. Or a woman is even wanting to become pregnant, invoke the divine. Our prenatal, the whole sanskaras for before conception of child, all that. So at every stage, insistence of something beyond. That's how you keep them tuned into the spirit while going through life. And for masses, this has to be given in the form of a religion. Again, going back to your question, Uma. So for few who have attained an inner training from maybe their previous samskaras, their previous lives preparation, and that's why I think Sri Aurobindo says in another previous essay, for us reincarnation is not only about reward, it is also about what we do today to make our future life easier. So the experiences that we gain, the one our psychic, assimilates at the start of a new life, the more inner life we pursue today is, we are closer in the training for going to the spirit a little faster. But for a large majority, it's through the religion that we get. And then another Indian concept that is very important, and that again is very unique to Indian way of looking at spiritual or religio-spiritual progress, is the concept of adhikar. Adhikar does not mean right, as our Manav Adhikar Samiti says. Adhikar basically means capacity. Are you capable of pursuing this path? The higher your adhikara, the more challenges that you get. In fact, as Mother said, the difficulties come more to the people who are ready to face those challenges. It's a pretty common wisdom in Indian households also, They say that, I've heard this many times growing up, when your life is going very smooth, everything comfortable, God's drishti is not on you. It's actually just turned away from you. Only when you get challenges in life, God is watching how you overcome these challenges so that you progress, you grow through them. So the higher the capacity, the higher the capability, the higher are the challenges given. So adhikara is the varying natural capacity. So those who are ready to become Meera are given that kind of life so that one grows into Meera consciousness. Those who don't have the adhikara yet, there are maybe other approaches. So this is the dynamic formulation. And again, as I said earlier, through all parts of the being we can grow. This is where Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga fits in so beautifully with the spirit of Indian culture. You are a person more working with your mind. Through mind, grow in perfection. You are a person more working from your vital, aesthetic, heart center. Become an artist. Grow in yoga through your art. You are more of an action. The Karma Yoga Marg is open for you. All kinds of things. You are more of an ethical kind of pursuit, person, the good, the right. Grow through that. Go beyond that. Aesthetic, through all these paths. And then if you are more of a bhakti temperament, more of a lover of higher, force, higher power, grow in bhakti. So all kinds of paths are given for you to grow so that eventually you go into what the Indian philosophy puts. Sri Aurobindo at one place says, there are 3 things India has given to the world, which science has failed. And in those 3 things, I love this 3 thing, he says. All answers are there. Brahman, yoga, and dharma. Everything is rationalistic critic can be, addressed. Again, 3, Sri Aurobindo defines, as he comes closer to these series of essays, he speaks of the 3 broad stages of Indian civilization. The highest one, or the first one, being the Vedic Upanishadic, where there was quite a loose, free-spirited inquiry into the highest realms of the spirit. And then there came a stage of more fixity, more formulation. So that's first is the age of the spirit, then it's the age of dharma and shastra, where things become more systemized. And eventually, as happens with all civilizations, there becomes more and more fixity and decay sets in. So India, he says, is presently going through this critical period of decay and disintegration. And it's up to us to see whether we can use this period of decay and disintegration to rise into the next Renaissance. That's why he titled these, his book is titled Renaissance in India. And going back to what we started, the theory of cultural criticism, cross-cultural studies that Sri Aurobindo gives, that you cannot judge any culture by just looking at the body and looking at when it's down, when its civilization is down. So all these studies, that whether it was William Archer or many others, starting from Max Muller's look at Veda, the Indology, the whole field of Indian studies that started, it happened at the time when Indian civilization was going through that 3rd phase, where it was already, in a period of decay, disintegration, tiredness, having suffered long hundreds of years of invasion before that. And it had gone into a mold of self-preservation, very closed, inward, inner, in. And yet, all these theories came about how India is a pessimistic, ascetic, navel-gazing culture because of that. And it was done to show that the Western, like I said, William Archer's political objective was very clear. Sri Aurobindo could immediately catch on that. He said it was done to show that because West is rich, it's the Western way that is the right way to take humanity further. Hence the idea of development, all of that, that even India, caught on to that after independence and things like that. A culture, if you have to judge a culture, judge by these 3 things. Again, 3. What are these 3 things? See, he's such a systematic, organized writer. First, by its essential spirit. Second, by its best accomplishment. And third, by its power of survival, renovation, and adaptation. This is the 3rd where we are at. We have to look at how quickly we can renew, or how meaningfully, rather, not quickly is not the right word, how meaningfully and harmoniously we can readapt and renew that essential spirit in new forms. So just one example, Sri Aurobindo says, Chaturvarna had its truth, but the integral age demands an integration of all 4 turnings of the soul. So the Brahmin also has to know what it's to be like Kshatriya. The Kshatriya also has to know what it's to be like Vaishya, and so on, because that's the need of the future humanity. So the old was gold, and yet we have to take what is there and put it in a new form for the future. So do not judge a culture when it's in a state of poverty, confusion, disorganization, or temporary decline. Really a wonderful model of cross-cultural studies is there in these essays. And as I said in the beginning, it is all about Sri Aurobindo's vision for the 3rd dream, the future of humanity, where these 2 major blocks of humanity, which have for so long misunderstood each other, if they have to be brought together, that's this kind of cross-cultural study is needed, because as Sri Aurobindo says, the 2 continents, I have the quote right here, the 2 continents, I guess you can call it just East and West, are 2 sides of the integral orb of humanity, and until they meet and fuse, each must move to whatever progress or culmination the spirit in humanity seeks by the law of its being its own proper dharma. West need not become East, East need not become West. They have to pursue their own dharma, because a one-sided world would have been the poorer for its uniformity. We want unity, we don't want uniformity. So even if India has a huge, rich diversity, each diverse group has to pursue its own, first seek, identify its essence, its dharma, and progress in its own dharma to keep the Indian unity richer, diverse. Diversity in oneness, as Sri Aurobindo titles a chapter in Ideal of Human Unity. Oneness need not be a monotonic thing. Unity need not be a uniformity. But the richness, the diversity has to be there. Because a one-sided world would be a loss for the entire humanity. So this is where, Sri Aurobindo's third dream would come in. And again, he ends up with a question. So the question that he sets up, he gives us to reflect upon is, which way do you want to go? All that he's described about the culture of India, or the vehement secular activism of the modern mind? This is his phrase. The vehement secular activism of the modern mind, which wants to create an upheaval and, kind of like in a spirit of revolt, let go of all the truths of the spirit, which was the age of rationality. He said it was the age of revolt. The Western Renaissance, the Western Enlightenment was born in an age of revolt. The Indian Renaissance has to be born in an age of harmony and unity. Unity and diversity. So the question is, which way you want to go? And if it is, first, if you think it's the Indian culture, you have to ask the second question, that this Indian religio-philosophical spiritual view of life, is it going to be available only to the rare few? Or does it have to be universalized? Or has it to become more of a mass movement, which is where we are heading? The truth of the Veda that was, or the secret of the Veda that was reserved for a few, came down in the form of legends and stories through Ramayana and Mahabharats and Puranas and the Bhakti movement. It became more and more universal. Now Sri Aurobindo's concern is not just the mind and the heart, which were taken care of by these two stages. Now the outer life has to be divinized. So that means the truths of the spirit have to be universalized, which is where all life is yoga comes in. The entire life has to be divinized, and the truth of the Indian culture, or the truth of the religious, spiritual, philosophic view of life has to become, I guess we can say, has to become universal, has to be given to masses. So no more that this is only for the few initiates, but it has to be a universal spirituality. So this, in a sense, is the 6 essays, A Rationalistic Critic on Indian Culture. I think I have taken way too long, but I couldn't have summarized, more than this. Thank you. So.